You know what I'm going to do? Let's get started so that we can. I think we already jumped into it, but I'm going to officially welcome you, Alan, and our listeners to, I call it the Agile Conversations. And with me, I've got my mentor. I do respect Alan a lot, Alan Richardson. I worked with Alan long, long time ago. I think it was Channel 4 the first time. And I still remember my interview, and thank you for doing this. Alan, I went online to find your profile. And I think very, very, very humble. You put, I have skills that span the full development process. I use them to help teams build software better and help companies sell more products. I like where you framed it, but I'm going to give you a chance now just to introduce yourself before we get into the meat of the conversation.
Um, well, hello, I'm Alan. I've been in software development for a long time with lots of different roles. I mean, I started as a programmer, and initially I started as a programmer working on fairly low level stuff, building compilers and interpreters, but then got a job with a testing company because they wanted to build software testing tools. Um, then it's hard to sell tools, so they sell people. So then you move into consultancy. Testing was new for me, so I learned as much as I possibly could. And what I liked about testing at that point in time is it gave you the chance to do a lot of development work because automating was massively in its infancy. So if you wanted to automate in those days, it was quite hard. And you generally had to build your own tools. Testing was in flux because it was highly structured and it wasn't optimized. So you were finding ways to optimize it. And we were changing everything at that time with exploratory testing structured. People were coming up with Agile. Everything was in flux again. All the formal development approaches that we'd learned, all the structured development, all the diagramming, people now have almost completely forgotten about that stuff, but it's still there and underpins it.
Yeah.
Um, I did quite a lot of independent work as a contractor. And so I've jumped around between contracting and permanent and then consultancy. Consultancy to me is a different thing. You come in for short periods of time, you're very focused on one thing. And you need a different set of skills to do that because you need the communication skills, but you also need the learning skills to get up to speed quickly on people's technology, to be able to ask the right questions, to harness their knowledge and expertise
Mm.
to help them identify the gaps, and then do research quickly to try and give options and then explore the options with those people. And I've done marketing, like actual physical digital marketing, because I've also done that for my own stuff. Because when you create your own books and courses and training, you have to market it.
Absolutely.
I've got a stack of books there on system theory, stack of books there on sales and marketing, books there on IT. It's just everything comes together in that whole development process.
And I think that defines who you are, Alan, because as a tester, you've got to keep learning, right? And that's why I can see you've got all these books that you've picked up over the years to keep developing yourself. And that seems to be working well for you.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, let's jump into it. So, Alan, the first concept I want us to explore is obviously I've been doing a lot of work around Scrum teams. And one of the things that we teach that is that Scrum is about getting done increments, done products, which is every single sprint, be it 2 weeks, be it 1 month, be it 1 week. The expectation is that the Scrum team produces a software, an increment that is done, which is usable. It means that done means it's usable and it's useful and it's valuable. And usable in the Scrum terms means it's free of defects. So now, because of the work you've done around testing, and I know how much you've done on that in that space, what are your thoughts in the role of testers within a Scrum team?
So this is so hard because every team is different,
Yeah.
right? And I tend not to focus on Scrum, so I'm much more of an ad hoc agile person, and everything is adaptable and we change it all the time. But again, no one really knows Scrum in depth. So people use the Scrum words and we work in sprints and have all the Scrum paraphernalia, even if we
Yeah.
don't necessarily do that. But I mean, it depends on who's on the team because you want a team to be strong with different strengths. So if we're focused on a particular role, that might actually be a problem
Mm.
because people try and figure out if people build development processes around roles, that doesn't adapt well enough.
Yes.
So you always have to look at, okay, we want testers on this team, but who are the testers on this team? Because you can't just go, right, the role of a tester in a Scrum team is they will automate, they will do exploratory testing, they will liaise with customers to address requirements, they will look at product owners and address risk early in the story creation, because not everyone is going to be skilled enough in all those areas to do that, and they might not be the right person to do
Right.
that.
Right.
So if we look at the role of I guess on Scrum, what people could do is look at the role of a tester and what activities we're associating with that role,
Yeah.
what skills we require in order to do that, and then spread those around the team. So
Yeah.
I would more likely try and spread them around the team. I mean, I work on a team at the moment, and we don't have the concept of tester. Right? Everyone is a developer. Everyone is doing coding. Everyone is doing testing. And we all test in different ways because we have different skill sets. And so we pair to augment those skills in different ways. In some meetings, because I've got a big testing background, I come up with more risks than anyone else. And
Yes.
I'll identify risks in the system designs. But I'll still come up with system designs, and then I'll identify risks in the system designs I've come up with and how we've chosen to implement it.
Well, but in your current team,
Yep.
does that mean that you have a job to almost influence everybody else with those skills, or do they start looking towards, let Alan help us with that because he's probably got the strongest skill? How do you manage that?
No, so everyone influences everyone else. So we all pair and we hopefully learn what our strengths and weaknesses are. And because you're pairing and because you do pull requests, you're reviewing other people's stuff. And part of that process involves testing it. You don't just review the code, you might bring it down, you might use it.
Yeah. So, yeah.
And also it depends on the development approach, right? Because Scrum is the
Mm.
methodology that sits on top, but that doesn't dictate all the development practices, right? The Scrum
Yeah.
dictate branch-based development or trunk-based development,
Important.
the length of the sprint, how long you're going to do in it, how you're going to track the stories, how low you're going to split them down into. Does a story have to be something that you can do in half a day, 2 days, a week? If you've got a 4-week sprint, maybe some stories people put in are like
Yeah.
2 to 3 weeks, which would be mental, but I
Yeah.
can imagine people doing that.
Yeah. But what do you say to teams though that do a lot of testing as an afterthought at the end? So
Um,
yeah, what do you say to them?
well, it even depends when the end is, right? So if the end is we do a 2-week sprint and then we build it all at the end, we try and merge everything in and then hurriedly test it with throwing people at it, and we haven't spent the time creating any automated execution coverage, there's just so many risks in there. So it's not so much the fact that people are testing at the end. You have to look at their entire development approach. Where are the risks? Where are the safety nets? I mean, Agile is a hard thing to do because it is so open to interpretation.
Right.
So everyone thinks they're doing Agile, and people probably do Scrum and go, we're doing Scrum, everything's sorted now. But you still have to estimate, you still have to break things down into small enough chunks. And you should be getting done early and constantly merging into the main branch and having that in a done state, a releasable state, a state that adds value. And if the thing that you're working on that you've just checked in isn't functional at that point, then hide it behind a feature flag, or but it can still be there.
I think it's pretty much about making your software usable at any point in time, isn't it?
Yep. Keep it running, and that's where continuous integration, automated coverage and execution all the way through is really important because it gives you that confidence. I mean, there's some parts of the system that you'll be happy to release if the build works because you've got so much automated execution coverage in there. There's some parts you want to pull down and have a look at because of the complexity of the work that's been involved, the complexity of the integrations, or because you know that you've got so much tech debt around that confidence execution coverage and you haven't got it in place yet.
Yeah.
But if people are naive enough to not try and harness every part of the modern development process
Mm.
and instead just go, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to use this thing called Scrum. We're going to have 4-week sprints, going to split it down into chunks, try and estimate it. We're going to code it, then hand it over to testers on week 3, and they can do it. And until at that point, testers, you can sit around and automate. Then we'll get there, and then you can tell as it works.
Yeah.
That's just hopelessly naive and not optimized for any people that are involved. It's a very lazy way to try and manage a project.
You know what I call it? I call it unprofessional. Is that too harsh of a word?
It's unprofessional.
It's unprofessional, I think so. All right.
People don't think through their processes. They don't think through their risks, or if they do think through risks, they think in terms of business risks.
Yeah.
They don't think through the actual risks of our development, the actual risks of skill gaps in our teams.
Yeah. Yeah.
The risk of not having trained people and expecting them to just work.
Yeah.
Leaving builds to be non-functional for long periods of time and continuing to merge code in. It's just not acceptable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's something else I was going to ask you about, Alan. It's about user acceptance testing, especially when it's a separate phase outside of this time box I've called sprint. It could be an iteration, right? And I've seen it before where organizations are built. There was a bank I did work for, and we build, say, every 6 weeks, and then it goes into a UAT environment where it's expected that users come in to use that software. And after like about a month, that's 10 weeks, we're then able to release that. Meanwhile, we are building the next iteration already. So there's that overlap. And you've got this UAT phase. It's very common in the big organization. What are your thoughts about that?
So I think the most important thing about the phrase user acceptance testing is the user acceptance. It's not the testing, right? Because users have to adjust business processes often. They have to see that what's coming in matches their business process. But again, very often it's an excuse for not building a system that works properly. So like and by system, I don't just mean the software system, I mean the people system. If they're not involved in the specification of what they want, and they don't get to see it often enough, and they don't get to pass feedback on smaller chunks, and it's relied on because you know what happens in these UAT phases after like a 6-week sprint, it's not finished, it's not really ready to go out because there's bits that are half done because you couldn't estimate properly in those 6 weeks, and you can't constrain yourself to that. So that Agile requires that ongoing evaluation and release process. And if something isn't ready, but it's not killing anything when it's in there, you just don't use it. But if something is ready, then start using it early and pull it in. I think it's useful to have some of the trappings of a UAT process, right? In terms of the environment. Very often getting the environment in a point where you can actually test something against realistic data with realistic load is hard. And individual teams find it often very hard to create that. And if you're in a big organization with lots of teams working on different things with systems that integrate with each other, very often that UAT environment is the only place they're going to integrate. So some of those concepts are really important for helping make sure everything is working properly. But if that's the only place that the systems integrate and that's the only place you've got that data, it also means that no one has been able to automate between systems prior to that. So the UAT phase is likely to pick things up that it probably shouldn't, but it's purely because of a gap in the capabilities of the system development process that sit before it. And often it's trust.
Go on, Alan.
Often it's trust, right? They've built that process because the users don't trust the software development teams to create something that is going to work when it goes live.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can resonate with that because, so I might be in trouble for this, but I'll say this, Alan. I'm wrong, right? I've always said any UAT should be done within the sprint. And I've actually had one organization that I worked so hard to get rid of UAT. This is why I found out, Alan. There are three things why people do UAT. Scenarios. This is why I found out. Scenarios that the dev team do not know about. And it's just like UAT test scenarios. Number two, you said is test data. And number three is environments. And I believe that if we can get those three things into the sprint, those scenarios being run in UAT environment, put into the sprint, the data getting into the sprint, so the testers and developers have got access to it, and then the environment, find the right environment. I tell managers now these days that if you care about going fast enough, then let's bring that data, let's invest in the environment so that the team, Scrum team, product team, can have all those resources for them to do all the testing. Then we can almost make UAT phase redundant. What do you think?
So each different part helps us address different types of risks.
Mm,
So if the only place that you're mitigating the risk of the system integrating is in that UAT environment, that's one of the things you want to try and push forward.
yeah,
And it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to replicate that environment early. It means you have to look at the connection points between systems
yeah,
and figure out how to make sure that they function prior to going into the UAT environment.
yeah,
And representative data, because very often the data in UAT is big.
mm,
It doesn't necessarily need to be big. It just needs to have the variation that that data represents. Because
mm,
big data is associated with stress and performance testing.
yeah,
We don't need to do that all the time. But
yes,
if your system is handling lots of data all the time, then you
mm,
need to do that type of testing early and prior to the UAT environment.
absolutely,
UAT might be associated with a dry run phase. Maybe you could get rid of the UAT process by, or not the, or the UAT environment by releasing it into production in dry run mode. So it's
mm,
there, it's processing, it's just not doing all the stuff associated with it. And you gradually enable that when you're comfortable and you've got it through. There's
yeah,
lots of approaches. If we
yeah,
stick to concepts like the phases or the roles, we don't come up with enough creative approaches. I mean, that's where things like contract testing comes in. That
absolutely,
that is an attempt to avoid the overhead of end-to-end integration testing, but still get fast feedback on the connectivity between systems. It
absolutely,
has risks and issues associated with it when you introduce that process, but then you address those within your development process.
yeah,
So again, it depends what
yeah, yeah,
people are
yeah,
doing and how they do it. Because I think UAT works badly when the user community have a 600-page document of scenarios and scripts that
mm,
they always run through. That's horrible, right?
mm,
The development team should be helping the users know that they don't have to do that because we've put in place this process. We've
yeah,
got this automated execution coverage and it uses your data here.
yes,
We have something that will do that beforehand. So you can just start getting rid of all this stuff and
yeah.
then be more creative about the UAT.
Yeah. So you mentioned, Alan, you mentioned something about trust. And I want to pick on that. How do you think the product team, say Scrum team, product team, can gain that trust with their users? I think that's a very big thing that plays in organization. Trust. How do you gain that trust?
So, I mean, it's all to do with openness, and openness means showing things early and working with people. But it depends how you lost that trust, right? Because most people trust by default. So if we no longer trust, it means that things happened. So we have to address those specific things, get the trust back, and very often it's a protection mechanism. So people have been burnt so often, and very often companies have so many layers of management that each layer of management is trying to protect their part of the system. And so trust has to happen at all the different levels in the organization. So when we
Mm,
say, how can the product team get the trust back? That's often hard because often the trust isn't lost by the product team. The
yes.
trust has been lost because things were overpromised at a management level.
Yeah.
The teams know things are slipping and things aren't ready, but it's been promised that it will come in. So it gets rushed in, even though it's not ready.
Yeah.
Someone over here is having a political battle with someone over here. Very often that doesn't happen at the team level. But if the teams can make enough connections and they can speak to the users and they can show it and they can try and bypass some of it. But again, it's just openness and about being honest and human
Yeah.
and
Absolutely.
stop playing politics.
Absolutely. I tell teams that I train these days that one of the ways I've found to build trust is to deliver, get stuff done.
Yeah.
You've
And
got a goal, get it done. Make sure it's working. Make sure it's tested. Make sure that, and you should, and share your the outcomes, share the failures, the successes, what you've done, and how you've gotten there. And
and
that's
the questions and the empathy, trying to understand what these people are trying to achieve and how they do it,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
gather new features and functionality from them as you're speaking to them and feed it into the backlog. Because very
Absolutely.
often we don't prioritize what the user needs, we prioritize what management want or someone else wants to do something. But if there's issues in there that are hanging around for a long time, that builds up resentment.
All right, great. Thank you very much. One question I've been wanting to ask you. I know we talked about this many years ago. Testing versus checking. I've heard that thing a lot, I think, from a few guys in the testing community. What are your thoughts?
Um, so so testing is by nature an exploratory process, right? We're trying to explore, we're trying to experiment. We can encode some of the coverage that we've got. So I tend to use different language. The reason I'm hesitant saying this is I don't use the words checking,
Yes.
because when I look in the dictionary, checking is often used at a definition level to mean the same thing as testing. So the words are hard. We have programming concepts, right? Checking, again, if we say we're checking the software, what does that mean? Chances are it means we've created some automated execution, right? And I tend to use the word automated execution instead of automated testing, right? We've got some automated execution, which is covering parts of the system. As it does that, we have assertions. So we actually have words in programming called assertions. Those assertions check that certain conditions are in place. So
Yeah.
that's the point where the checking thing
Came from.
comes in. But I don't need to use that word
Mm,
because I can talk in programming terms
yeah.
about how we do that. And for me, the checking is not the scenario, the checking is the assertion.
Yeah.
And we have to use words like test when we're talking about automated execution because all our frameworks use test as an annotation, right? If you're using JUnit, it's at test. If you're using PyTest, test is in there all the time. And what's interesting about the testing versus checking thing is that people try and make too strong a divide. If we're programming the system and we're doing TDD,
Mm,
when we're writing the the tests, the at test methods with the encoded assertions, we are testing at that point
yeah.
because the code doesn't exist. And very often, what we'll do as we're testing it, we'll have that coverage. We'll add extra unit tests in place
Mm,
to explore it and see if it's adding any extra value. If it's not adding extra value, we'll rip them out and just rely on the TDD based stuff.
yeah.
And also, we don't just do TDD at a class level, we do TDD at a behavior level, which then change. Because if you're going to do TDD, you want it to be robust in the face of refactoring,
Yeah.
which means you can't just have test classes that map on directly to other classes in the system, because then you're tightly coupling the test with those classes. So you have tests that act as a behavior level that span entry points into the code base, and then there's multiple classes underneath that.
Mm,
That gives you more flexibility, and you have a longer term use. And in theory, those are much more like scenario tests that you would do earlier. It's just that they get fixed. So at that point, the difference between testing and checking is we should understand the risks with relying on automated execution coverage. It only checks for and asserts for the things it has been coded to do.
mm,
The testing process has more flexibility in what it can observe and interrogate and look for during that process. And that's the real difference. We have to understand that they can both work in concert with each other, but
Yeah.
we have to understand the limits of our automated execution process.
Right. Great. Thank you very much for that. I've got about two more questions and then we round this off. So my next question is, where do you see manual testers that don't have programming skills within an agile team, say a Scrum team? And also, and one thing I also want you to think about, maybe help lean into, is I believe that an organization cannot truly be agile, respond to innovation, and be, competitive in the market if they do not invest in a lot of technical excellence. Talk about automated execution, talk about CI/CD. So how do you marry that with people that don't have technical skills and are just manual testers? What do you see in
It
the
depends. Depends what that means in that manual tester, because it's not a role thing, it's an individual thing. So if we say they're a manual tester because they can't write production code, but they may be massively technical and in-depth in security testing and capable of writing scripts that can exploit the
Yeah.
system. Many security testers and penetration testers are not commercial level programmers. So in that sense, they're not technical, or
Yes.
but they are hugely technical and they can rip systems apart and do things that no one can imagine.
Yeah.
Some testers are particularly good at thinking through risk, right? The fact that you can build something doesn't mean you can figure out all the risks associated with it falling apart.
Mm,
But we also have to understand the limitations. If you can't read code and you refuse to go down to that level, there are some risks you're never going to spot because they're
mm,
in there in the code, right? I mean, we've addressed one of those about 6 months ago. It was a risk that I saw when we were looking through the code. Today, we had a production issue. The thing that we fixed back then is the first time we've ever used it. It was an edge case that we never expected to happen. It happened, so we had everything ready. So we were able to fix that
do it.
production situation,
Yeah.
because we'd addressed the risk early, and because I had been able to advocate for it, and because I was in a position to push it, and because I saw a gap in the scheduling where we could actually fit and address that risk. So I, I think it depends on people's uh, biases for what they want to learn.
Yeah.
Because nothing is super hard to learn. It's just that we need the experience and we need the point in time where we can use it.
Yeah.
And in an environment where you're not going to get shot down the first time. Like if you're trying to do risk analysis and then you come up with a set of risks and everyone looks at your risks and go, these are garbage. You'll never do risk analysis again.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
need an environment where you can practice and you need people who can listen, but
Yeah.
you also need to develop this strength of character where you go, I don't really care what you're saying, I'm going to carry on with this because I think it's important.
Yeah.
And I mean, the people who become managers very often are people who didn't intend to be managers. It's just that they saw that the managers were not doing a good job of managing, and
Mm,
they then went, why is everything not working? So they go and read some management books, and
mm,
then they look in the book and go, this seems nonsense because this is what these guys are doing. It doesn't work. Then they'll see something else and they might get lucky and find something that goes, oh, well, clearly this is different. Why don't we do that?
yeah.
But they can't present that. So the only way that they can push that into the real world is by becoming managers or doing more management. And
Interesting. Yeah.
all these skills you can build up even if you're not in that role.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with you. And maybe to extend that a little bit, how do you see the testing or QA evolving with AI?
I don't know. I mean, I don't use any AI tools. It really depends what people are going to use them for. I mean, is it AI in the sense that people are using it as part of the development process, or is it AI because we're incorporating it in our system?
I think using as part of their process, how can it help them?
So, um, when people use AI as part of their process, they are going to have to do so much more testing and so much more coverage and so much more TDD type approaches. Because if
Mm,
you're letting AI build the system or even function as a system from a set of requirements,
mm,
you have to be sure that that's going to work in all the situations that you want it to.
Yeah.
And if you can't figure out how to test that, or you can't figure out how to have an automated set of coverage, and you can't figure out where it might go wrong,
Yeah. Yeah.
and if you haven't got the mitigation strategies to roll it back when it starts doing whatever madness it's inevitably going to do,
Yeah.
the technology just isn't there yet. So if,
Yeah.
or it might be there for some use cases, and I just don't know them. I haven't seen them. So if people have got the good use case and they've got the AI to fit it, and the risks in production are minimal, or they've got experts using it,
Yeah.
then great.
Yeah.
I just don't think it's commercially there as a generic use case yet.
So do you use ChatGPT personally in any of your scripting coding today?
No. What I do, so for all my coding and testing work, I don't have any AI. For my marketing work, I use AI.
Yeah. Yeah.
For my learning, I use AI. Right, I've written a little tool which will download podcasts for me and then convert them into text. So I don't have to listen to
Nice.
the podcast. And so it's using the AI models to convert speech into text. And then there's that will run into another system that will summarize it. So it does use the chat GPT interfaces to with the prompts to summarize the content. So
Yeah.
what does this content mean? What give me like 7 bullets that will summarize it. And when I'm putting up my own stuff, I will use AI to summarize it, but I have to edit it first.
Yeah.
So I never just go AI do release,
Yeah.
because there always has to be that human in the middle.
Yeah. Right. Okay. I mean, just because we're talking about AI, I will tell you one thing I found out many, many years ago, and I don't know if you remember, we at Channel 4, we used to do a lot of regular expressions and stuff like that. And I figured out that ChatGPT could help me with regular expressions. So before I would have to go into the web and try different things and see if it works, group it for me. Now it's a matter of conversation with ChatGPT. Can you extract this from that string? It writes for me, oh, that's not what I want. Can you group that for me? And you know what? 5 minutes, I'm done. So that's something I found. Hopefully, someone found that useful. My last question, Alan.
So
Yeah, go on.
associated with
Go
that,
on.
if you create a regex like that and put it into production, you have to make sure you have enough data in the front to make sure it's not matching the wrong things. That's
Absolutely.
that's the professional responsibility associated with
Yes.
using AI.
Yes.
But for personal use, it's absolutely fine.
Yes. Absolutely. And again, because you don't have to, you can't trust it, right? You've got to test it. So yes,
Yep.
I agree with that. I agree. And thanks for chipping that in. My last question before we wrap up is there's always been that often developers, testers, even yesterday, someone was telling me that at work, when they do estimate, they do dev estimates, test estimates. And it's something that I actively advocate against. I think it should be one team. And this is why I love the Scrum framework, to be honest. I think it doesn't solve everything, but I think it's simple enough. It's got developers. And which means in the Scrum framework, testers are developers. So I think for all I like from you, Alan, is to kind of tell, maybe help our listeners is how does that influence ways of working within a team? Just that having everyone as developers within the Scrum framework. What do you think?
So so it's really interesting because some people that implement Agile really badly call everyone developers, but don't expect the same from everyone, right? So they call some of from some of those developers, they expect them to only program. From
Mm,
some of those developers, they expect them to only test. From some of those developers, they expect them to only gather requirements and speak. So really use different words, because you've partitioned out the roles so much that they're so non-overlapping. If
mm,
everyone's a developer, what you're doing is you're building a team based on the strengths and weaknesses of the individual. So, I mean,
mm.
have you seen, what do they call it now? So it used to be a Kvyat diagram. I think it's a radar chart now. So you have a
Yes,
kind of circle with spokes
yes,
coming out, and then you
yes,
plot
yes,
things on it.
yes, yes.
So
Radar chart.
those, so you could draw a diagram like that for your team, which has all the skills and responsibilities that you want, and then you can go, right, well, Bob can do this one, George can do this really well,
Yeah,
and you could plot these people with different colors. And
yes.
if only one spoke is covered by one person,
Yeah.
you have a risk that that person's too busy to do it, that person is absent. So the concept of developer is that that should be um, strong all the way through, and you have overlap
Yeah.
because you're trying to slot people in.
Yeah. Yeah.
And remember, developer means product skills, risk skills, management skills, coding skills, ops skills, the dev skills, automated execution, strategy, being able to think the long term. It's an aspirational role, and it's something that I
Ab-
continue to aspire to. That's why we
Absolutely.
read all the different stuff.
Absolutely. And if you look at it, I mean, in the Scrum framework again, we teach that the Scrum framework requires self-managing teams. And for a team to self-manage, they must be cross-functional, which is all the skills that is required. And you make a very good point. The product owner has got the product skills, strategy, the Scrum Master, process, efficiency, helping the team develop, supporting developers. You've got your developers, your BAs, your database people, your testers. So everyone having all that skill. And the point you make here is that people that have predominantly skill set of being a tester should also pick up development skill of some sorts. Developers also should care about testing, and everyone should do bits of everything. Of course, people have strengths in certain skill sets, but as a whole, you should have more than one person able to carry out every single capability that is required within a team. Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
I think that the key is the whole,
Yes.
because we have to respect people's biases
Mm.
and what they like doing. If you
Yeah.
force someone to learn how to code, and if they're never ever going to write production code and you force them to learn TDD and all the AWS interfaces that they're never going to use, they'll hate it. But if
Yeah.
you teach them how to code to the extent that they can get value out of it for the activities they're doing, then they
Mm.
can build on that gradually.
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
and everyone, I mean, not everyone on the team is going to know how to communicate effectively, but you can coach people up to communicate better. Very often in teams, people are really quiet and never ask questions or never raise risks.
Mm.
But if you speak to them afterwards, they will have questions and they will have risks.
Yeah.
So very often it's up to some people on the team to identify that not everyone's doing that and then set the culture and set the examples to demonstrate how to do it and to demonstrate that it's safe in this environment.
Mm.
Like, a lot of people don't ask questions because they don't want to look stupid. So
Absolutely.
I'm happy to be the first person to ask a stupid question, so that because I know that someone else probably has the same um, question, doesn't know the
Yeah.
answer, and
Yes.
then they can see that I didn't get
Okay.
shot. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Wow. Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you very much for, I mean, it's been about, I don't know, about 35 minutes, 38 minutes, just under 40 minutes of having this interesting conversation. But thank you for your time. Do you have any last thoughts that you want to drop before we round it off?
I don't know. I mean, just everyone learn as much as humanly possible and keep expanding what you're doing.
Yeah.
um, Keep raising risks, keep learning more. I mean, I'm always trying to learn more stuff. Like in my spare time, I'll try and do security testing because I need a safety net. So if ever there's so many layoffs, so the
Yes.
thing that will protect us is we need skills that we can use outside a team, and no one pays you for most skills, but people will pay you to find security issues in their software. So I view that as a transferable skill in the real world. But
Absolutely.
again, learn as much as we can, keep experimenting.
Wow. Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you very much. To that point that you made, it's very quiet in the consulting coaching space. And guess what? I've gone back hands-on. I'm actually helping a startup in the US right now to integrate Wiremark. They
Yep.
have a lot of external dependencies, and I'm there writing integration testing, in Python. So yes, you're right. Pick up, keep learning, because that might be what keeps you, paying your bills in this economy.
Yep.
You
And
know,
that's a transferable skill. You get Python. Python is used for so much AI. So
yes.
you're moving into the AI thing. All my AI stuff is written in Python.
Oh,
Half my marketing tools are written in Python because, again, there's so many libraries that will hook into other systems.
yes.
So it's often just glue code that we're writing between other people's libraries.
Wow. Wow. Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you very much. And yeah, so I would stop that
Cool.
recording now.
Thanks very much, Sam.